Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by CRT Laboratory. The topic we'll be addressing is integrative medicine for adult ADHD. The presenter who will be leading our discussion today is Dr. James GreenBlatt. Dr. GreenBlatt is Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Medical Services at Walden Behavioral Care. He's board certified in child and adult psychiatry. He received his medical degree and completed his adult psychiatry residency at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He also completed a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School. Dr. GreenBlatt lectures extensively throughout the United States and Canada on integrative therapies for mental health. He is also the author of 6 books, including those on depression, eating disorders, and ADHD, including Answers to Anorexia and the Breakthrough Depression Solution, which outlines a personalized 9-step method for beating the physical causes of depression. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. GreenBlatt to begin the content portion of today's webinar.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And last month, I spoke about integrated therapies for ADHD in kids. And the message was individualized support and trying to identify unique kind of biochemical, environmental differences and treat that. The adult ADHD treatment is, I think, a little simpler. And tonight, I'm just really going to focus on 2 or 3 interventions that really can be done without significant testing to help your patients with ADHD. So to start, this is Alex, who was a good student in high school, went off to college, struggled his first year. Parents kind of took it as, first year, not really focused and paying attention and being on his own for the first time. By the time his second year in college, he started doing really poorly. He went to the counseling center. They put him on stimulants because he wasn't paying attention. So he was taking Adderall through the day, and he was so agitated. He ended up getting Xanax at night. And he was kind of alternating between Adderall and Xanax throughout days and nights. And when he came home for vacation, parents were quite worried, and they brought him in to see me. And most of our adults walk in with a diagnosis of ADHD. It doesn't just appear. And so we did routine testing, and we found this relatively healthy college student, deficient in iron, B12, zinc, many nutrients, and he turned out to have celiac disease. So the punchline for our adults as well as for our kids, we need to look for underlying causes. Nutritional deficiencies are common. With our adults, we often can find the cause, and celiac disease is not uncommon. So treating the celiac disease, gluten-free diet, and this was diagnosed by biopsy for Alex, all of a sudden the ADHD symptoms disappear. We talked about this. I'm going to have some slides I'm going to go through quickly so we get to the interventions, but these are just the diagnoses over the years, over the 100 years, if you will, that we tried to name this disorder in kids and adults, and every few years we change the name as we decide what we're going to focus and do research on. Tremendous variation in both kids and adults. This is France, less than 5% of kids diagnosed and medicated, and almost 11% of children in America. And here you see that you cannot prescribe stimulants to kids under 6. The reason I used to run ADHD clinics, but haven't been as involved. But the reason why I wrote the book on ADHD this year and started talking about it again is because of a real concern of over-medicating. And this is the Academy of Pediatrics now recommending medications for kids as young as 4 years of age. And we're now doing research on antipsychotics with ADHD. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs for our pediatric kids. And when we talk about adults, I'm going to go through these next slides quickly because pretty much we're all saying the same thing, is that ADHD does exist in adults. The symptoms don't go away. Some people are worried that it's a new fad, because if you see here that when we changed the DSM criteria from DSM-4 to 5, we meaning the psychiatric community, wanted to make it more inclusive. So we increased 65% those that now have a diagnosis. And what does it mean to get a diagnosis? Well, then it means you can take a medication and get a medication approved by an insurance company. So by changing the criteria, we're increasing the diagnosis. But I think the literature is quite clear that most of our kids with ADHD continue to experience symptoms. We talk about hyperactivity in our children, in adults. It's more these internal sense of restlessness. Sometimes it's cognitive restlessness versus behavioral. And these are what I would call the 5 core symptoms of adult with ADHD. We know what inattention is in school, but I think poor persistence of effort is a better term when you're trying to get tasks done, whether it's work or home. Impulsivity, again, cognitive hyperactivity, variability in performance, and difficulty with rule-governed behavior. And the variability in performance, it's really that inconsistent production of work over time, both school, work, and many parents and many spouses in particular get upset because if they could get their work done or finish a project one week, why can't they do it the next week? And that's really the hallmark of this disorder, this variability in performance. It does not mean that it's behavioral or intentional. And then difficulty with rule-governed behaviors, adults not reliably follow rules, knowing what to do versus doing what you know. That follow-through is very difficult for many of our adults with ADHD. So we have emotional impairment, we have behavioral impairments, and this is just a list of what happens untreated. And the research is quite substantial now. Fewer years of schooling, more divorces, not working up to your potential, greater use of substance abuse, prison, psychiatric hospitalization, and even mortality rates. The most striking research is just around driving. More driving-related accidents. And then this is kind of the dramatic study. Sober adults with ADHD drove similar to intoxicated controls. So in terms of psychiatric comorbidity, 5 times anxiety disorder, conduct disorder, marijuana, and then I'll end lower life satisfaction, job preparedness, again, substance abuse, depression, obviously self-esteem. So the point with these introductory slides is that ADHD is a neurobiological disorder. We notice it most commonly in children. In adults, it is functionally impairing, and we need to treat it. It doesn't mean we need to treat it with medications. The U.S. is one of 2 countries in the world where we can watch our TV ads in front of us, or our kids can watch them. But my point is we need to treat it, and I'll talk to you about integrative biological interventions that are non-medical. This slide here is just to kind of remind us that when in children, most of the medications, a higher percentage of meds are in males. But in adults with ADHD, the higher percentage of stimulant medications are written for females. So females have a higher percentage of medications than males. Again, I ran an ADHD clinic, and this is what my life was like. parents wanting the quick fix, give my child a medication, and parents not ever looking at medications. So as, of my practice, I had two parents that talked to me about these OPCs. They're called oligomeric proanthocyanidins. I only am allowed to say it once, so I just use the term OPCs. We'll talk a little bit about what they are, but some of these articles, there was a chapter in Gene Carper's book on miracle cures about OPCs and ADHD, and this Keats publication about OPCs also came out. And this was the same time that I had parents telling me that they treated and cured their child's ADHD with these OPC products, and would I be interested in looking at it? And that's what I'll talk to you a little bit about this evening. So these oligomeric proanthocyanidins, I actually said it twice, that's good. These are the phytochemicals, the deep colors in our fruits, blueberries, grapes, green tea, dark chocolate. It's in red wine, and it was actually first discovered in peanut skin. But the history is interesting because in the 1500s, the Native Americans cured some of the French crew who had scurvy, and they didn't have fruit, but they gave them needles from the pine bark. And this French scientist, Jacques Masquelet, read Cartier's journal and knew that there wasn't a lot of vitamin C, and how could he cure scurvy? That's when he started isolating these flavonols, these proanthocyanidins, from the peanut skin, and then he found them in grapes and many other dark compounds in nature. So for us, we'll talk about OPCs, these phytochemicals having a wide range of effects on ADHD. We use it for children and adults, but there's a common effect. There's literature looking at impulsiveness, aggression, grades, restlessness, all improving with these OPCs. But we first need to understand a little bit about brain waves. And many of you have heard the term alpha waves. When you're meditating or relaxing, those alpha waves are calm, kind of meditative brain waves. But the two that we're most interested for ADHD are the ones circled here. And let's do the beta waves first. The beta waves are those brain waves that are produced when you're focused and paying attention. And those are those very small brain waves, and they're called beta waves. And the theta waves are those daydreaming, those large daydreaming brain waves that are obviously common in ADHD. So ADHD individuals have been shown over many research studies over many years to have a ratio of higher theta to beta. And this abnormal pattern of these EEG brainwaves has consistently been demonstrated for about 15 years now. And when I started my ADHD clinic, we would look at these EEG patterns, and we would look at this ratio of theta to beta. Again, theta being those daydreaming brainwaves, beta these short focusing brainwaves. Okay, so first take-home point, increased theta to beta ratio in ADHD. And these are just some of the studies that this theta to beta ratio is predictive of ADHD across the lifespan. So we have kids, we have adults, we have adolescents, all demonstrating this ratio. And this abnormal EEG activity was really the basis for the development of neurofeedback, because neurofeedback is this biofeedback for the brain, if you will. It's training the brain to change that brainwave pattern. So what are we doing in biofeedback? If the theta to beta ratio is elevated, then neurofeedback, what we're doing is we're decreasing theta waves, and we're increasing beta waves. And neurofeedback has been demonstrated to level 1 support by the Academy of Pediatrics. And I'm not going to go through all these studies, but we have research spending many years looking at neurofeedback, some compared to medications. Here, neurofeedback was as effective as Ritalin for ADHD. This was 30 sessions. And here's another study where the neurofeedback group improved significantly. And the importance, I think, of some of the neurofeedback work is the improvements we're seeing in 2- and 6-month follow-ups. When we look at medication, amphetamines, the Ritalin, the Adderall, and Vyvanse, when the child is taking the medications, the symptoms are relieved. As soon as I stop the medicine, the symptoms return. Neurofeedback does changes that are permanent and long-lasting. And then our last neurofeedback study, these are 100 kids over 5 months. And another study that showed the neurofeedback group had greater, quicker improvement, and it was sustained for 6 months. So we're not here tonight to talk about neurofeedback, but this mechanism of decreasing theta waves, increasing beta waves, works. It works for the treatment of ADHD. So what I did in the 1990s, after these parents kept knocking on my door, telling me to try these OPCs, I said, well, let's prove it. So we started looking at EEG patterns in children and adults, and we started seeing some, dramatic changes. This is a 13-year-old boy, and the slides were done about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but you can see that the EEG, so when this adolescent was 3 different tasks, baseline, which is staring at the computer, reading a story, or listening, we see the theta waves of those red bar graphs. So those are the daydreaming brain waves. And then the beta waves are the yellow. So when we followed this boy, and we have many cases of adolescents and adults, what we saw when we gave them OPCs, the grapeseed, pine bark, blueberry extracts we'll talk about, there was a dramatic decrease in the theta waves. So if you see the red baseline, the theta waves, and then this is 30 days later on OPCs, you see this dramatic decrease in theta waves. All these graphs, and this research was done with Dr. Joel Lubar. For anybody who knows neurofeedback, he's the grandfather of neurofeedback. He invented it, and he put together these studies for us. And then here's kind of a summary slide. Without OPCs, you see the high theta waves, those high daydreaming brain waves, and then with these OPC extracts, we decrease theta waves. So here's the reading task, which was most traumatic. One of the common things we see when kids with ADHD, if you and I go to read a book, we would focus and our beta waves would increase. Many of our ADHD kids, the opposite occurs. They have these increased daydreaming brain waves. So to summarize our little EEG class here, the theta-beta ratio has been shown to be predictive of ADHD across the lifespan. So what we would like to do to help focus and pay attention is to improve that theta-beta ratio. And I shared with you, and the research is quite clear, that neurofeedback does improve that theta-beta ratio. You can focus and pay attention better, and it lasts. The reason I don't do neurofeedback in my practice any longer, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, it can be 2 or 3 times a week for many months. Our kids don't necessarily have that time, and parents, not all parents can afford it. But what we were able to demonstrate is that OPCs, these phytochemicals also, 30 days taking a couple pills, also improve that theta-beta ratio. And what's happened over the last 20 years is that we now have, supporting research why OPCs are helpful for ADHD. And that's what I want to share with you for the next few minutes. So we have research looking at OPCs. I shared with you the decreasing theta waves, which was our work, but OPCs are antioxidants. They moderate catecholamines. They maintain the blood-brain barrier. They decrease copper, and they act as antihistamines. So let's discuss some of these. We've spoken many times in terms of both food allergies, but also neurotoxins, whether it's heavy metals or environmental pesticides, all shown a relationship to ADHD. And what OPCs do is they have this affinity for collagen, and they enhance that blood-brain barrier. So there's a much more tight blood-brain barrier, and we believe that helps prevent food allergies. Food allergies are common. We talk about the leaky gut, but I think we can refer to the leaky brain. We have research going back 20, 30 years looking at food allergies as a cause of ADHD in kids, and most of the research has been done with kids. Some people have noticed differences in adults. These are IgG-mediated food allergies, not the immediate hypersensitivity IgE allergies. And OPCs not only act to prevent that IgG immune complex, but OPCs are actually very, very powerful antihistamines. They've been written about as antihistamines for allergies for many, many years, and the mechanisms is inhibiting the histidine decarboxylase, so we have this decreased mast cell activation. So OPCs enhance the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. They act as antihistamines, and then we have research as antioxidants. OPC has been studied for years. They're much stronger antioxidants than vitamin E and vitamin C. Pine bark is pycnogenol, is the most common OPC used in some of the research. And here, with kids with ADHD, there was measures of increased DNA damage. With OPCs, there was decreased DNA damage and improved antioxidant status with improved attention. We also have OPC's effect on glutathione. So this, again, was pycnogenol, 1 milligram per kilogram per day for 1 month of 43 kids with ADHD, and improved glutathione ratios. Another study looking at ADHD kids and OPCs, and here we have normalizing catecholamine levels and reducing oxidative stress. Increased catecholamine levels associated with degree of overactivity and impulsivity, and this study demonstrated a decrease in catecholamines with OPCs. When I talked about pediatric ADHD, we talked a lot about lead and copper, so we certainly got a lesson in lead poisoning. Excuse me. The literature on lead and ADHD goes back many, many years. Every 10 or 15 years, we lower the safe limit of lead, and we've gone from 10 to 5 to less than 2, and now it's pretty clear that there's no safe lead levels, that the incidence of ADHD is markedly higher. And in Massachusetts, after the Flint water crisis, they were looking at both lead and copper. And we've talked in the past about the zinc-copper ratio. And one of our concerns has been for ADHD, both in kids and adults, is low zinc and elevated copper. So one of the things that we found with OPCs is that OPCs decrease copper. One of the most common things we see on both kids and adults who can't tolerate stimulant medications are individuals that do have high copper levels. We would use a zinc supplementation, but also OPCs to decrease that copper-zinc ratio. The literature around zinc and ADHD, again, goes back many years. To summarize it here, we have zinc predicting stimulant response, much higher serum zinc levels being low in ADHD, zinc being used as a treatment to augment the stimulant medication, and zinc being used by itself. Most common, we see low zinc as a result of this high copper. Copper is in our water supply. It is very commonly elevated, and OPCs and zinc are important. So here, well, let me save this slide. Let me just go to this slide first. This was, again, healthy students. These were adults given pycnogenol, 100 milligrams per day of pine bark, a good source of OPCs for 8 weeks. And here we have improved attention, memory, executive function, as well as a decreased anxiety, decreased by 17%. And then newer studies looking at cognitive enhancement. So a lot of the earliest studies were done with grapeseed extract and pine bark. These are now blueberry concentrates, very small amount, 1 ounce of blueberry concentrate here, given compared to placebo for approximately 12 weeks. It was fMRI scans as well as cognitive testing. And here the blueberry group versus the placebo group, increased brain activity associated with cognitive tests, improved working memory, improvement in blood flow. So brain activations associated with memory and executive function. So there are many other studies. I just shared a few, but to summarize, OPCs have been looked at since the 1990s. There's numerous case studies written. We've written to many journals on our case studies, and there's also good literature, sustained attention. What has happened over the last 20 years is now looking at mechanisms. We see not only the decreased theta wave, decreased copper, improved catecholamines, antihistamine effects, as well as enhancing the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. We use many sources of OPCs. I'll summarize now the work that I've done almost 25 years now, that I found the most effective OPC supplements are those with combinations. In the early years, I looked at pine bark, I looked at grapeseed, and the ones that I've had the most success are combinations of different OPCs. Again, green tea, pine bark, blueberry, grapeseed. There's a supplement that I worked on with pure encapsulations called Curcumin Sorb Mind, which has multi-combinations, as well as a blueberry kind of concentrate blend with some good research called Neutrophenol. So there are others that we've shown to be helpful, but the clinical message for me has been mixed OPCs have been more helpful than the single phytochemicals. We'll come back to OPCs. I want to talk about 2 more nutrients that we use for adults with ADHD, and that's going to be rhodiola, and it'll be lithium, nutritional lithium, which I've talked about before. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So many of you heard me talk about lithium, probably the most helpful nutraceutical that I use. Lithium was in that primordial Big Bang, was one of the first three elements in the universe with hydrogen and helium. And the adults, as well as the kids, with the impulsive, irritable, angry kinds of symptoms with ADHD. Many of those are the symptoms that become most difficult for the individual. It impairs job performance. I talked earlier about higher rates of divorce, higher poor job dissatisfaction. Many of the marital issues are around this quick anger and irritability. Lithium has been incredibly helpful. This is from a New York Times article. I don't believe in God, but I believe in lithium, about pharmaceutical lithium helping bipolar illness. The lithium that I'm referring to is nutritional lithium. We use lithium orotate in doses of 1 to 20 milligrams. There are three ways that we look at if someone might benefit from nutritional lithium. So an adult with ADHD, three things we would look at. One is family history. The most important components of family history would be substance abuse in the family, and the individual in front of you who has ADHD does not have to have substance abuse. We also look at a family history of depression, a family history of aggression, family history of suicide. Again, the individual with ADHD that you're treating might not have those behavioral or substance abuse symptoms, but family history is part of the equation. Clinical history, number two, I mentioned that irritable, impulsive types of ADHD. And then this trace mineral analysis. Lithium is a natural constituent of the human body, the brain. We can't function without it. And looking at hair mineral analysis, you can see here, lithium is extremely low. Oftentimes it's undetectable. And it's just a nice guide putting those three factors together of those that we would recommend nutritional lithium. This is just summarizing the kinds of dosages that we use. The pharmaceutical is 600 to 2,000 milligrams. These are dosages that can cause side effects. Side effects could be anything from permanent kidney disease to thyroid disorder to increased thirst, acne, weight gain. The list goes on and on. It's very rare that I prescribe those dosages of pharmaceutical lithium. Lithium is also toxic and fatal if taken in overdose. So the question is, what is this maintenance area? And to me, it's somewhere between 1 and 5 milligrams. And then, is there a deficiency? We clearly know that there are communities that lithium is deficient in the water, and those communities have higher rates of suicide, depression, but also aggression and poor impulse control. And in my work, I believe that there is those that are genetically prone to have higher needs for lithium, so might be deficient based on their environmental lithium supply, which again is in the soil, which means it's in the water. Our transition to bottled water over the past 25 years has likely dramatically affected the amount of lithium that we're getting in our diets. But that maintenance level varies, and I think looking at those clinical symptoms of irritability and impulsivity with family history, with that hair analysis, can help predict who would benefit from lithium. So the nutritional lithium here is from ADHD to Alzheimer's. Most of our concern today would be the young kids with ADHD or these young adults and adults that had not been treated continue to have poor impulse control, road rage. A lot of ADHD we see associated with road rage. It's one of the earliest slides. And I have many case examples of people presenting as parents, not parents, spouses brought in their spouses for problems with road rage, completely eliminated with nutritional lithium. Okay, OPCs, lithium, and then rhodiola. So rhodiola is a medicinal herb I'm sure many of you have heard of. I think I'll go to this slide. This was one study looking at 17, 19-year-old students, 100 milligrams a day. This was a stressful exam period, and there was improvement in motivation, mental fatigue, well-being, and physical work capacity. Rhodiola is a very powerful nutrient. Dosing, I think, is really important. Number one, let me talk about potential side effects. I would not use rhodiola for patients with bipolar illness or individuals that are very anxious. Rhodiola can be stimulating. I've actually admitted patients to an inpatient psychiatric hospital who have taken rhodiola on their own for the treatment of some illness that they read about and became hypomanic and required inpatient hospitalization. For those that were looking to treat ADHD, we're often looking at numbers between 100 and going up to around 400 milligrams per day. I always start at 100 milligrams to see if someone gets agitated, see if they notice a difference, and then titrating up slowly. Most, again, for ADHD is under 400. For severe depression, we've gone between 400 and 600, but oftentimes someone would become more agitated. If you titrate slowly, you often get an improvement in many ADHD symptoms, including attention, focus, and motivation. Excuse me. Rhodiola, in terms of the mechanism, rhodiola kind of prevents the reuptake of the neurotransmitter dopamine, and so it keeps it around in the synapse longer. So here, kind of a summary as to what we're trying to understand. For those non-scientists in the audience, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that helps us focus and pay attention. It is produced by the amino acids, phenylalanine, that's essential amino acids we get in our diet. And we make dopamine in one cell, the presynaptic cell. It crosses that space in the middle, and then it reacts to the postsynaptic cell. So there are many, many areas in our ability to make dopamine that have both genetic and epigenetic potential variations. So we have genetic differences in how quickly we make dopamine, in our dopamine receptors, how quickly we break down dopamine, the COMT and MAO genes at the top there that break down dopamine are all kind of genetically determined. And the epigenetics is what can change those genes, and that could be everything from stress to inflammation to nutritional deficiencies. So, this evening I shared 3 mechanisms of or nutraceuticals that we can use: OPCs, a nutritional lithium, and rhodiola to help adults focus and pay attention and treat a biologically based illness that I'm referring to as ADHD. I don't believe in the term, the myth of ADHD, it doesn't exist. I believe there are those individuals that are clearly genetically vulnerable to struggling with sustained attention and poor impulse control. But this slide summarizes other things that we didn't talk about. We can look at using amino acid precursors like phenylalanine and tyrosine. We can look at understanding folate and zinc, and looking at understanding the genetic differences in dopamine receptors. And here's a summary slide of this concept that we can use these phytochemicals, the OPCs, rhodiola, to prevent breakdown. Quercetin and curcumin prevent breakdown of dopamine, as well as kind of preventing the reuptake. So once these neurotransmitters are synthesized, we can use phytochemicals to control and sustain their action in the synapse. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. We use the term attention deficit disorder, but as we kind of go through the big picture and understand that it's likely not just attention, that we have clearly deficits in many nutrients, zinc and magnesium in particular, sleep deficits, most common in kids, but we see them in adults. And then for both our parents and our spouses, the need for kind of respect and understanding this illness, not blaming those with poor attention or impulse control, trying to provide that respect and understanding. You have much to learn, my son. You can't say on with his head after you said off with his head. This just reflecting that the consequences of untreated ADHD are serious, and the long-term outcomes of not treating ADHD. So many parents are concerned about medicating their kids because these amphetamines are going to turn them into individuals that abuse drugs because these are controlled substances. Well, the research, not that I'm advocating amphetamines, but the research says treating with amphetamines actually decrease substance abuse. And my message is you don't need to use amphetamines, but we do need to treat ADHD. Untreated ADHD is poor long-term self-esteem, poor social function, compared with non-ADHD controls. Treatment is associated with improvement in outcome. Rhodiola, OPCs, and lithium are the simplest for adults. Testing is not required. Magnesium is often deficient in all of our kids and most of our adults. So we look at magnesium, understanding zinc-copper ratio, understanding, food allergies, GI tract, and many other things that we discuss in our book. Here was this, it was a full-day conference that we did. Dr. Hallowell, who discusses a strength-based approach to ADHD. Dr. Shaw talks about environmental toxins in ADHD. Jay Lombard talks about genetics in ADHD, and I talk about various nutritional deficiencies. So these are all available at the finallyfocusedbook.com, and this book kind of helps parents and adults look at a very systematic hierarchy of the nutritional deficiencies and environmental toxins that might be contributing to ADHD. My world is as an integrative psychiatrist. If medications are needed, I'll use them on a short-term basis. My preference is to avoid amphetamines when we can try to understand an integrative approach. So why don't I'll stop there. If you have specific questions, you can reach me at the email. So let's see if I can answer some of your questions. One question is OPCs contraindicated. I guess in my experience, I've never seen a side effect to OPCs. As plant-based phytochemicals, I guess there's a theoretical allergy to grapes or blueberries or things of that nature, but I've never seen it. So I've never seen a side effect to OPCs. I've seen some individuals respond more dramatically to others. I have some patients that I treated in the 90s where I did those studies that continued this day to order the same OPC supplements for the past 20 years. Is there an optimal composition of an OPC supplement? Over the years, I've worked with a couple ones regularly, and again, the only thing I consistently found is the combination. So I try to not just prescribe pine bark, so I try to use combinations and the one supplement from Pure Encapsulations, Curcum Soar Mind, is where we can combined the blueberry extract, the pine bark, the green tea extract with curcumin. The comparing the pediatric and adult ADHD, are there any defining characteristics? I think in my practice and almost 30 years, I think the food allergies are much more significant in our pediatric population, the kids. So for children under 6, I'm 90% sure that the food allergy contributing to the behavior symptoms. With adults with ADHD, food allergies are not the major concern that we end up finding. The magnesium is consistent, the lithium for that subtype. So again, the treatment plans are very different. I guess what I try to stress here is for adults, I often can provide a treatment plan that's effective without testing. For many of our kids, I really want to get it right. So looking at testing provides me a more focused treatment plan. Am I looking at elevated copper and need to focus on zinc and OPCs? Or am I looking at food allergies or Clostridia or lithium? Someone talked about pine bark lowering homocysteine and hot flashes. I think once you start looking at the OPC and pine bark literature, it's really endless for a whole host of illnesses. The important pieces are mostly associated with antioxidant property, antihistamine properties, its collagen cross-linking properties. So there's a whole host of mechanisms. To clarify, is rhodiola contraindicated with ADHD and anxiety? No, I would not say contraindicated. With bipolar and anxiety, I would say yes. But I would just start low. For someone with ADHD and slightly anxious, one, I'd want to see if there's a mechanism, and we might use magnesium first. So ADHD and anxiety, to me, is a recipe for magnesium. 400 to 600 milligrams total during the day, 2 to 3 times a day. After the magnesium, I might introduce rhodiola, absolutely, to eliminate the need for medication, to improve attention and concentration, but I'd probably start with magnesium. Excuse me. Other questions. What forms of magnesium? We use all forms of magnesium except for magnesium oxide. So magnesium glycinate, magnesium threonate, magnesium citrate, magnesium sulfate. I've had success with all forms of magnesium except for magnesium oxide. 80–90% is not absorbed, so it's just in the gut, which usually would cause loose stools. So we try to avoid oxide, and the other forms of magnesium are most helpful. The specific product that we developed and did some work on for Pure Encapsulations is called Curcum Soar Mind. So I did develop it. So it's got, again, as I've said, it's got pine bark, green tea, and a blueberry kind of flavonoid blend that's had many years of research on cognitive improvement. So we were trying to look for some evidence-based blends that were shown to be helpful, and mixing that with the pine bark and green tea. Absolutely, OPCs can be given to children. Again, as I've said a couple of times, in children, we're kind of focusing on what's going on. But for inattentive ADHD kids, both pycnogenol, there's probably 10 or 15 studies. The OPC blends, there's many studies, and we've been using them for many years. We want to look at the underlying source, but when you think of the classic ADHD kid with high copper, food allergies, and inattention, that's where I tried to demonstrate OPCs address many of those problems, and sometimes can be a simple supplement. Someone brought up B6 taken with magnesium. B6 helps magnesium get into the cells. So oftentimes some of the magnesium supplements have B6 in them, or taking a B complex with magnesium can be helpful. I've certainly seen magnesium work without B6, so I wouldn't say it's a requirement. Oftentimes someone is taking B6, they're not getting better, and it's not moving in any of the testing markers we're using, either RBC magnesium or hair mineral analysis, and then we're recommending B6, and then there's improvement. So if you can take it at the same time, it obviously does enhance absorption of magnesium across the membranes into the cells. Since many multivitamins contain copper, how much zinc needs to be taken? If we're looking at a child with ADHD who's demonstrated to have high copper, most often detected through the hair mineral analysis, I would be avoiding all multivitamins with copper, at least for 3 to 6 months. We really want to bring the copper down. I'd be using zinc by itself. For kids, it's 15 to 30 milligrams. For adults, it's 30 to 90 milligrams. And then after a period of time, and again, usually retesting, we would try to have a balance of 1 or 2 milligrams of copper to 15 to 30 milligrams of zinc. But initially, if someone has high copper, you really want copper to be out of all nutritional supplements. Okay, so it's about 8 o'clock. I think, okay, one more question here. What labs for kids? Let's see. So the Finely Focused book, sorry for the commercial, but it does systematically go through all the lab tests that we would look at. Many of these are, simple, that can be done through routine labs like vitamin D or B12. But for our kids with ADHD, we are looking at specialty labs. We might look at food allergy panels. We might look at organic acids for elevations of metabolites of Clostridia and yeast. We might look at levels we talked about of copper-zinc ratios, magnesium, lithium, neurotransmitter testing. The bigger picture we can get, the more focused our treatment plans can be. Again, many of our kids are, mild symptoms. Adults, we can oftentimes add some of these nutritional interventions without the testing. But for those kids that are taking medicine, or many aspects of their life are impaired due to these impulsive, aggressive, or inattentive symptoms, I think it's worth looking at the testing to systematically try to understand a more personalized treatment. One more question slipped in. Using supplements that are out there that are not in the form of capsules. Yes, there are many, again, of the labs that have liquid supplements. Again, I consult for pure encapsulations, and they have a full line of pediatric child supplements, mostly liquids. So we have liquid zinc and liquid magnesium that can be used for children with ADHD. So I will stop there. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. We can do a lot for supporting these kids with ADHD. Oftentimes we can eliminate medications completely. We certainly can eliminate side effects to medications with the nutritional support that we discussed.